The story of Joshua SHIV could be your story. It could be your son's story. A story of a smart kid, perhaps too smart for his own good. After a near-perfect SAT score, Joshua was educated in prison, not the Naval Academy. The author of the gripping new book, Privilege Lost, gives an oral account of his life before, during, and after his 5 years in prison in this 12-part podcast series, Losing Privilege. Losing Privilege, Joshua, we left off, you made a friend. His name was Fred.
I did.
We had spoken earlier, before your incarceration, even before your trial, even before your plea deal, about your mental toughness, about what you had learned through going through your training, and how tough mentally you were, and how you felt that you could withstand anything. Was that mental training what you relied upon in the first year and 4 months that you were incarcerated? Because you had 3 months or so before your plea deal in Pinellas County lockup. You took your plea deal. You thought you were going to a country club. You end up going to a private facility that you were there for about a year. But prior to switching facilities, you were detoxing, and you had an opportunity to try to get help. But in trying to get the help, you actually got yourself in a position where you were facing nearly 30 years of your life in a federal prison.
It was going to be 30 years of my life in state prison because, because the guards and the employees there were county workers, not government workers. They just had a contract to house the federal detainees for the government. So it was going to be 30 years in state court. In state prison. So what ended up happening on that was the guy that I hit was the brother-in-law of the only felony judge in the county, to the best of my understanding. It was a good old boy town, kind of in the middle of nowhere, Central Florida, and everybody knew everybody. The only industry in this entire county was the prison industry, and everybody was connected. So what was presented to me was, if you take it to trial, argue self-defense, and lose, it's 30 years that I'm gonna spend in prison. If I took it to trial and I won, arguing self-defense, I would still be found guilty of a lesser included offense of simple battery, which carried a maximum of 5 years, and they were going to give me 5 years. Then they offered me a plea deal of 5 years. So it's 5 if I win, 5 if I don't take any chances, and 30 if I lose. Kind of a no-brainer. The best I'm going to do is 5. So I signed a plea deal for 5 years.
Now, doesn't that give you kind of a scarlet letter in terms of the guards know what your background and what your history is?
You know, I was terrified that it would. On the other side of that, I knew that it was going to give me a little, I believed it would give me a little bit of extra security with the inmates, because beating up a police officer
that's got to be a badge of honor on the other side.
You would think it is. And to some it was. So I wasn't really worried about that. I also wasn't really worried about the inmates, because even if it wasn't a badge of honor and I'm just the lone white boy in a predominantly minority, prison system, I wasn't worried about it, because as long as I didn't kill another inmate, the most time they could give me for battery on a detainee was 5 years, run concurrent. Well, I'm getting 5 years anyway. So as long as I don't kill somebody, I wasn't worried. I was going to hurt people if they tried to hurt me, and it wasn't going to make things worse. What I was worried about, though, was I was worried about that potential scarlet letter, because yes, everything I knew about the system, that was going to follow me. Everywhere I went, the first thing they were going to see is, this guy beats cops.
Before we get into what happens next, mentally, for that year, you talked about in the previous episode, being beaten nearly every single day, inhumane conditions, not being able to eat.
So let me answer your question.
Mentally, how did you get through that?
So I'm going to answer your question on that. I would love to take full credit for it, that it's the toughness I had gotten in the Marine Corps, or the toughness I had gotten with martial arts and military school. It wasn't any of that. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My grandmother was liberated from Dachau at age 16. She had spent all of her early and mid-teen years in the concentration camps, and all of her most of her childhood in the ghettos. My grandfather had spent his early 20s and late teens in the concentration camps. So the mental toughness for me, more than anything else, was, if my grandparents could survive that, this could not nearly be as bad as anything they went through at the hands of the Nazis. So I owed it to them to survive this.
You need a break?
Nope.
So that's the mental. Let's talk about the physical. You went in, you were 6'3", 265. When you got transferred, how much did you weigh?
210, maybe 215 max.
That's not the kind of diet that most people want.
No, that was it was 50 plus pounds lost. 50 plus pounds lost in a really unhealthy way. Starvation is not the diet that you want.
So you go to court, you take another plea deal. In the previous plea deal that you took, because it was federal, you knew the range that you were facing. This time around, did you know specifically what you were pleading to and what the consequence was going to be? Or were you rolling the dice again?
No. So in the state court system, when you sign a plea deal, you know exactly what you're signing. The exact number of months, days, all of the terms are laid out in advance. It's not open-ended. In the federal court system, you sign a plea deal, you're pleading guilty, but you're pleading to a sentencing range, and it's up to the judge arbitrarily. If they're having a good day, you get the low end. If they're having a bad day, you get the high end, and there's nothing you can do about it. In the state system, you can negotiate that plea back and forth, and as long as you don't negotiate yourself right out of a deal, you know exactly what you're getting. So I knew I was getting a five-year mandatory minimum sentence in state court. I was supposed to have 3 years of probation following it. My dad paid off my probation. It was only a few $1,000s, but he paid the last 6 months or so before I was released. He paid off my probation so that I wouldn't come out with state and federal probation that have conflicting terms and expectations, and we're going to guarantee me to get reincarcerated.
When you pled guilty and you knew what your sentence was going to be, did you also know where your quote unquote home was going to be?
No. So when I pled guilty, there was 2 months of my original 18 remaining. And
the whole time you're in this same facility in the middle of Florida.
mm-hmm.
Okay.
So when I pled guilty, there was 2 months of the original remaining. I expected, I don't even know what I expected at the time. Actually, I didn't know. I thought maybe I'd go to federal prison, finish the last 2 months of my sentence, and then go to state prison and do 4 more years. But I wasn't sure. They might have taken me directly to state prison because it was so close to the end of the federal sentence. Or maybe I was able to spend all of my time in federal prison instead of in the state system at all, which would have been preferable because it would have been a whole lot safer. What ended up happening was they kept me there for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then the feds came and picked me up and took me to the federal prison. I did do 1.5 months there to finish out. And then they handed me over right back to the Florida Department of Corrections, who then brought me down to Florida from Georgia.
So now you are in a new facility.
Well, let's backtrack just a little bit because they pulled a pretty interesting stunt. A few months before I signed my plea deal, since they hadn't been able to push me to attempt suicide, and maybe they weren't comfortable committing outright murder while there was a pending case that I hadn't pled on yet, they put a convicted murderer in the cell with me. They were hoping that he would kill me and they would have no responsibility for it since I wouldn't kill myself, and they couldn't outright kill me yet. So they put this kid in my cell who was a real deal sociopath. He had been convicted of matricide. He had killed his mom in cold blood, like in her face, holding her by the throat while stabbing her repeatedly, and then got caught because he killed his girlfriend for having a problem with it, and then tried to force somebody else to help him hide the bodies. And he wanted to do it again. So they put this kid that had no compunction about killing, that wanted to kill more, that didn't have any remorse for killing his mother, in the cell with me. And I'll tell you what, I actually took advantage of that opportunity, man. I had reached rock bottom. That mental toughness, it fell apart. It fell apart. I showed this kid. We became friends, sort of, because he was aside from from Fred, the cockroach, this was the first time I had interaction with a human being who wasn't seeing an animal that they were trying to kill. And we became friends, and I had told him that, if I showed him how to do a military blood choke, and he was willing, I would let him kill me. I would sit there and let him take my life because I wanted out. I couldn't look at 30 years when I was 25 years old and imagine 30 years of getting beaten every day and being starved and tortured. And I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. A few months, a year, 30 years. I couldn't see 30 years. I wasn't even 30 years old. And he was so excited. So I showed him how to do a military blood choke. And the way it works is it cuts off the blood flow to your brain rather than the airflow. So in about 3 or 4 seconds, you black out. You totally lose consciousness. It's 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, unconscious. And then somewhere around 7 to 10 seconds, your brain starts shutting down organs, because your brain starts shutting down. Parts of your brain start dying because there's no oxygen, there's no blood flow to or from your brain. So he did that. He did that, and he held it for over a minute. He got interrupted though. That particular day, they had an officer filling in because somebody called in sick, and it was a new officer, somebody who didn't really know what he was doing. And instead of making rounds every hour, he was making rounds every 15 minutes. And so he made an extra round we didn't expect. Startled Ben, and Ben let me go. But I had been out cold for a minute, and I had a grand mal seizure. I came to, my heart picked back up. I woke up, I was coughing frothy, bright pink blood. I had my legs all spazzed. Like I lost control of my legs. People elsewhere in the dormitory through solid steel doors started screaming, "Hey, sounds like somebody's having a seizure." And I had a seizure right off the edge of the bunk. I couldn't walk. I couldn't do anything for a few days. And before I could give him an opportunity to try it again, they pulled me out of the cell. They separated us for something. He had some issue that he did something crazy, and they put him in by himself somewhere. And then I signed my plea deal. But that, like, I disappeared, and I was floating in nothing for what felt like an eternity. And there was no pain. I don't know that it was in heaven or hell or whatever. I just know that when because I died. My heart was stopped and everything. That knowing what I know about how I've taught, you cut off the blood flow and oxygen to your brain for over a minute. Yes, you're dead. And when I came back, it was like I was getting pulled back to my body from really far away. And it was like, no. And then all of a sudden everything started to hurt. But I was gone. I was ready to be gone. Yeah. And then I signed the plea deal. They put me in general population for about a month before I got shipped off and picked up by the government. And then that was a really interesting month too, because that was my first time being in general population with a major conviction. And it was really weird. It was really, really weird walking out of that cell towards general population. It felt wrong to be out of that cell. Like, I'm sure there's a disorder, a medical diagnosis when you start to identify with your captors and freedom feels wrong, but it felt wrong. I felt guilty. It felt taboo to be walking without my hands shackled behind my back and my feet shackled, and to not be confined to a 7x10 room. It felt really wrong.
So you find yourself in general for the very first time. You had been alone, and the only real interaction that you've had over the past almost 18 months had been a psychopath and a cockroach.
Yep.
What did all the other inmates look like to you?
That's a good question. At first, they all looked like potential predators, because after everything, I didn't know who was who and what was what. And for the last year plus, any interaction with a human had been somebody that was there to hurt me, to harm me. And I didn't really make friends with anybody. I talked to a few people. I got into a few fights because people wanted to take advantage of me. I wasn't there for terribly long either before I ended up getting shipped off to prison. But the people that were in general population, there were also people who were detoxing and fighting their cases, and everybody had to act bigger and tougher than they were, and everybody was a killer and everybody was a badass. And looking back, the guys that said, "Oh yeah, we're here for a DUI," or you're here for molesting children, and the guys that say, "Oh yeah, I'm here for attempted murder," no, you're here for drunken disorderly conduct. And the guys, "Oh, I'm here for beating up a police officer," no, you're here because you robbed a convenience store. But it took a while to figure that out, and I had to learn that the people that wanted to talk to me and be nice to me were usually the people that were the most dangerous, because they were pretending to be nice, because it's a form of manipulation that is more dangerous than just being an intimidating person. I could deal with the guys that came up to me and were intimidating. "Oh, give me your shirt, give me your biscuits." Yeah, great, take them from me. Let's see how you do. But it was much more dangerous when somebody showed me compassion, which I had forgotten what it felt like. And I've always been a very trusting person, seeing the good in people and trying to overlook or dismiss the bad, or acknowledging the bad and giving second chances. I always find that goodness in someone. That's how I try to look at people. And
it's a nice Jewish boy in you.
Yeah, it is. People are inherently good, and while good people do bad things, people aren't bad. And that set me up, because as soon as somebody showed me compassion, they talked to me. They had, "Here, man, you want to read a book? You haven't had anything to read. Like here, hey, man, I'm not going to eat the rest of my food. You want some extra food? I haven't eaten in a year. Yes, I want extra food. You're my best friend because you're giving me food. I'm starving." And that set me up, because I learned that as soon as you start trusting people, then they want something. Somebody leaves a candy bar on your pillow. You don't think anything of it. "Oh, wow, somebody gave me a candy bar." After you finish eating it, then the person, you don't even know who gave it to you, but after you finish eating it, then that person says, "Hey, that was my candy bar." "Well, it was on my pillow." "Yeah, but it was my candy bar, and now you owe me a candy bar." "Okay, great, I'll get you a candy bar." No. I want that same candy bar. See, and I didn't know what that meant, because I was an innocent kid, and I was learning to trust people. Well, no, I want that same candy bar. What that means is I want to get it by having sex with you. I want to get it from the inside. It took me a little while to figure that out. So find a candy bar on my pillow, I had to learn the hard way. "Hey, whoever's candy bar this is, I'm not interested. It's right here. Come get your candy bar. I'm not responsible for it." Or, "Hey, whoever put this candy bar here, you're not getting this candy bar back. I'm going to eat it. We can fight about it, and I'm going to hurt you. But you can come get your candy bar back, or you can let me eat it. You ain't getting it. You ain't getting it after I eat it." Like that, I had to realize that you had to really stand up, make it known in front of everybody. It was all about show.
What was easier, being in solitary and know what was coming for you every single day, or being in general population and having your head on a swivel because you never knew? Nothing was predictable. You went from a year of being able to pretty much predict what your life was going to be and what your days were going to consist of, to being in an area where maybe most people would consider that you had more freedom, which it sounds like you actually had less.
That is a loaded question. And depending on where we are in my 5 years, I would give you a different answer. But at that point, I would have said that being in general population felt more dangerous, even though it was less physiologically harsh. It felt more dangerous. I had to learn an entirely new way of speaking, of moving, of interacting with people, There was definitely a learning curve. If you were to fast forward, to the 2.5, 3 year mark through the 5, I would have said the exact opposite. At that point, I had learned the language, I had learned the politics, I had figured out what you can and can't say, how you can and can't say it, how to identify who's trying to manipulate you and not really be your friend. And like in the forest, when everything gets real quiet right before a predator strikes, same thing happens in prison. And I had learned how to pick up on that. So if we talked 3 years in, I would have said to you, it was much harder being in solitary confinement, because it's not the physical violence or the risk of physical violence or the stress or the chaos or anything else that really breaks a man. It's the boredom. It's the boredom and the lack of the loneliness that will break you. In the military, nobody breaks physically, right? They act like it's really, really hard, but nobody breaks physically in boot camp. We are scientifically, when you reach the point of absolute physical failure, you can't do anymore, you can't endure anymore, you think that you're done. Not another step, not another push-up. You've actually only used about 40% of what your body is capable of doing. It's just a mental barrier to keep going. So the physical part was never really the big part. It's the boredom and the isolation is what breaks you. And you don't ever really recover from that. That leaves permanent scars. The physical stuff, yeah, you get scars, you bounce back, you forget the pain. You never forget that boredom, that isolation. So in that immediate moment, I was really happy to not be in that cell anymore. I was really happy to have some freedom and some interaction. But there was definitely some times where I was wishing I was back in that cell. I told you, I felt guilty coming out of the cell. I felt like this freedom, I don't deserve it. It's wrong. I shouldn't have it. And it took a year or so before I started feeling more comfortable out of confinement and around people. But definitely the boredom is the hardest part.
Before we get, and we'll get into this in the next episode, the transfer. Two questions before we wrap up. One, did you miss Fred?
No, I didn't, because there was people to talk to, and I forgot entirely about Fred until I started writing my book and reached this portion of it and remembered Fred.
The other question is, you find yourself in general population, which for those of us that have never been in prison and our only frame of references are prison movies, Shawshank Redemption comes to mind. And the reason that I bring this up is the beginning of your story in the early episodes of this podcast series. You talked about how much of a ferocious reader you were and how you just absorbed knowledge. When you got out of solitary and you're in general population, did you find yourself reading again?
I did, because there was books floating around the dormitory. Other people had books. You could usually only get a book if you traded something for a book, but I got my hands on books. I started reading. I didn't care whether it was a Danielle Steele romance, mushy novel, country western novel. I didn't care what it was. It could have been an encyclopedia. I got my hands on books. I got my hands on legal resources. And it wasn't anything fancy, but I would just request case law. If I ran out of anything else to read, I would put a request into the law library and I would just read legal cases. It was something to read. It was something to learn. And it took my mind off of everything else, because jails and prisons are not accurately portrayed in the movies. Shawshank Redemption, American History X. I have never seen jail and prison accurately represented in anything that Hollywood has ever produced. However, I believe that Orange is the New Black. Piper Kerman did a really, really good job portraying the federal prison system, and there's a lot of similarities. So that's probably the best portrayal. It's a lot rougher in the state prison system, a lot less freedom. But you don't, when you watch Shawshank Redemption, you don't get a realistic, that was a movie that took place decades ago. It's very different. But it's a large room. Men are warehoused.
Oh, sorry, I tried. Oh. Sorry, let's pick it up. Federal prison is very different.
All right. So yeah, federal prison is a lot safer, a lot more freedom. The officers are generally politer and kinder. But Piper Kerman really did she did a great job getting it as accurate as was possible. They warehouse people. You've got 30 or 50 men in a closed-in space, open bay dorm. If somebody's tapping their foot, everybody there has to hear it. If somebody is whistling, everybody has to hear it. You can't get away from it. When somebody's showering, everybody has to look at it. If someone's going to the bathroom, everybody has to look at it. Everybody has to smell it. You can never really get clean. It's always humid and hot. Everybody smells bad. You can't really express the physical weight of the stench of unwashed bodies, but everything that is tainted by that. It permeates the air. It just smells like horrible body odor and fecal matter all the time. And it was rough. It's loud. You never actually see or hear on any of the TV shows or movies how loud it is. Every prison, every jail, every cell, anything I'd ever been in, it's all concrete floors, concrete walls, concrete ceilings. There's no sound dampening of any kind, and most of them are shaped in such a way that they actually amplify sound so that you can hear conversations from 45 feet away, regardless of where you're standing, just because the sound echoes. So if you think about a cafeteria in grade school or high school, it's like that, but all the time. Everything is loud. The shower is loud. The snoring is loud. Everything is loud all the time. You can't escape the noise. You can't escape the smell, and you can't escape the humidity. And that was different from solitary, because solitary was silent. It was so quiet as to drive you nuts because of lack of input and stimulation. This was the opposite. And for an average person, it would have been uncomfortable, maybe irritating. I have misophonia. It's a rare physiological disorder where you have a physiological sensitivity to sound. The most common manifestation is when the sound of chewing causes you to experience physical pain, right? That's the most common one, but it can be any repetitive sound. And for me, it's whistling, clicking, tapping, a foot tapping on the ground, somebody clicking their mechanical pencil, chewing. The incredible constant repetitive sounds of guys beating on the wall thinking they're the next rap superstar, and it's echoing and reverberating, or the guys that's standing in the corner talking to himself saying the same thing over and over again. I mean, just for me, the overwhelming sound was psychological torture, but it was also physical torture. in many ways, it was worse than the beatings that I was getting in confinement. And that lasted all the way until I was able to find myself at about 3 years in. I found myself at a facility where I was in 2-man cells, and I could go out and be around the noise when I was out of my cell, or I could be in my cell quiet, and there was a balance there. So it was really rough. It was really brutal. I found myself wishing I was back in confinement more than once early on.
Wrap up this episode with this question. Because you're so intelligent, and because you've also had the physical training, what was the biggest torture? The mental or the physical?
The mental. Absolutely the mental. Absolutely. I can wear an ass whooping. I can wear a beating. The mental, without a doubt, the mental, the isolation, the overwhelming hopelessness. Those are the two things that really do you in. You know, the single greatest strength and weakness of humankind is hope. And a little bit of hope can carry an individual through the worst things. The absence of hope can make even the smallest things insurmountable. So to be in such a horrific place and have lost hope made it psychologically unbearable. It was torture.
We'll leave it there for this episode. Losing privilege. Losing Privilege is a 12-part podcast series telling the fascinating story of Joshua Elishev and his roller coaster life of success and deception, love and loss, and the determination to survive prison and build a life after nearly losing his own. Visit joshuaelishev.com. That's Joshua, ELYASHIV.com for details on his book, Privilege Lost, his music, and upcoming projects. And listen and watch all 12 episodes of his podcast, Losing Privilege.